The snap at Fort Bragg Part 1. The kingdom. The sound lasted less than a second, a single crack sharp and clean cutting through the August heat like a rifle shot across still water. It rolled across the drill yard at Fort Bragg at exactly 14:17 on a Tuesday afternoon, and every one of the 300 soldiers standing in formation heard it. They heard it in their teeth. They heard it the way you hear something that cannot be undone. Then silence. Not the silence of an empty field. The silence of 300 people holding their breath at the same time, every eye locked on the two figures at the center of the yard. One standing, one on his knee in the dirt, his arm bent at an angle that arms are not supposed to be. Colonel Donovan Hargrove, commanding officer of Fort Bragg Support Command, had run this base for 8 years. He had never once knelt in front of his soldiers, not voluntarily. Captain Maya Carter stood over him without moving. Her boots were planted. Her back was straight. Her voice when she spoke was quiet enough that only the people closest to her could hear the words. But the words carried anyway, the way certain things carry, when the air around them goes completely still. She said, "You will never raise your hand at me again, sir." No one moved. No one spoke. In that silence, something that had been rotting inside Fort Bragg's command structure for 8 years finally broke along with the colonel's arm. But to understand what happened on that drill yard, you need to go back 6 weeks. You need to go back to a woman who had made a promise to her dying father, a promise she had kept for 16 years, a promise that on that Tuesday afternoon in August, she finally had no choice but to break. The story does not begin with Maya Carter, it begins with her father. Master Sergeant James Carter spent 22 years in the United States Army, the last 14 of them with the 75th Ranger Regiment out of Fort Benning, Georgia. He was not a large man, 5 feet 11, 185 pounds when he was dry, which was rarely. He had hands that looked like they had been carved rather than grown, and a way of moving through a room that made other people straighten without knowing why. Not because he demanded it, because he earned it. He did not talk about the things he had seen. That was the first thing people noticed about him. In a culture that valued the telling of war stories, James Carter almost never told one. What he talked about instead was craft, the mechanics of survival, the geometry of pressure and leverage. He had studied Krav Maga the way a carpenter studies joinery, not as a display, but as a foundation, and he believed with the quiet certainty of a man who had tested the belief in the worst possible conditions that the most important skill was not any single technique, but the understanding of when to use it. He started teaching his daughter when she was 9 years old, not because he wanted her to be a soldier, because he never wanted her to be afraid of anyone in the world. Every Saturday morning before the rest of the neighborhood was awake, before the Texas sun had climbed above the rooftops of their San Antonio street, James Carter and his daughter Maya were in the backyard. She was small for her age, always had been, and she stood in the grass in bare feet while her father moved around her with a patience that was different from his patience in any other part of his life. He corrected her form with 2 fingers. He made her repeat a movement 50 times before he allowed her to move to the next. He did not give her false praise. When she did something right, the praise he gave her landed harder because of it. He taught her to read a room the moment she entered it. He taught her the difference between aggression and threat. He taught her that the goal was never to win a fight. The goal was to make the fight unnecessary. And if that failed, the goal was to end it before it could become something worse. He was still teaching her the summer she turned 16. That August, a convoy in Kunar Province, Afghanistan, hit an improvised explosive device at a bend in the road where the mountainside fell away into a dry riverbed 300 feet below. The blast was significant. The details are the kind that remain classified for reasons that have less to do with security and more to do with the fact that putting them on paper makes them real in a way that is difficult for institutions to absorb. Master Sergeant James Carter was 44 years old. He had survived 2 tours in Iraq and 3 in Afghanistan. He did not survive the road in Kunar Province. A letter arrived before the official notification, 2 pages handwritten, folded into thirds inside a plain envelope that had been carried by a fellow ranger and delivered in person because James Carter had asked that it be done that way. Maya read it alone in her room. Most of it was the kind of thing a father writes when he knows there is a real possibility he will not come home. The things that matter and the things you never quite find time to say. Near the bottom of the second page, written in his careful, unhurried hand, there was a single instruction. Don't use what I taught you unless there's no other way. Your mother's already lost enough. She folded the letter. She put it in a box under her bed. She kept the promise for 16 years. She joined the Army 2 years after his death, not because she was following in his footsteps, and not because she felt called to service in any elevated sense. She joined because the grief had carved out a space inside her that she did not know how to fill with anything else. The structure, the physical demand, the relentless forward motion of military life was the only thing that moved fast enough to stay ahead of the emptiness. She was a good soldier from the beginning, not because she had her father's name or his history to carry her, but because she worked. She stayed later than anyone. She read more than anyone. She absorbed tactics and logistics and field medicine and chain of command and combat ethics with the same methodical patience her father had used to teach her a proper defensive pivot on a Saturday morning in the backyard. 2 tours in Iraq, one in Afghanistan. A Purple Heart for a wound she described in the paperwork as minor and never mentioned again. By the time she was 32 years old, Captain Maya Carter was what the military called a seasoned tactical commander, which is a phrase that covers a great deal of ground. What it meant in her case was that she had seen enough to know what she was doing, and she had done enough to know that what she had seen was not the worst of it. She arrived at Fort Bragg Support Command in the first week of July 2025 on a standard rotation transfer. Her unit was composed of 41 soldiers ranging from a 19-year-old private from rural Wyoming named Garrett Finn, who had been in uniform for 11 months and still occasionally looked startled to find himself there, to a 37-year-old staff corporal who had deployed 4 times and fixed things with his hands the way other people solved equations. Maya had commanded units before. She had a method. She learned their names before she learned anything else about them, because names were the thing that mattered most when everything else fell apart. She came to Fort Bragg with one intention: do the work well, keep the promise, go home in one piece. She was 5 feet 4 inches tall, and she weighed 119 pounds. She walked into her first officer briefing at Fort Bragg in a room of men who were larger than her in almost every measurable way, and she sat down, opened her notebook, and prepared to do her job. Staff Sergeant Marcus Briley was the first person to form an opinion of her, and it was not a favorable one. Briley was 44 years old and had been in the Army for 15 years, which meant he had survived long enough to develop a calibrated skepticism toward the things that the Army told him to trust. He was not a large man either, but he had the quality of stillness that comes from having been in enough dangerous situations to understand that economy of movement was not laziness, but intelligence. He watched people the way a mechanic listens to an engine, not for what it was doing, but for what it was about to do. When Maya walked into that briefing room, Briley watched her for about 30 seconds and then looked away. He had seen officers transferred in and out of Fort Bragg his entire career, capable ones and incompetent ones, and the ones who were somewhere in the middle and rarely caused trouble either way. What he had learned through a kind of accumulated disappointment that he would not have described as cynicism, but was close to it, was that rank and competence occupied different categories. You could not infer one from the other. He did not form a judgment about Maya Carter. He simply noted that she had arrived and filed her in the same category as everything else he was waiting to see. What happened 4 mornings later changed the filing. It was 5 in the morning. The base gym was empty, or nearly so. Briley had come in early for a scheduled maintenance review of the equipment, which mostly meant making sure nothing was broken and writing down what was. He was making his way along the far wall when he heard movement in the open training area near the back, and he stopped. Maya Carter was alone on the mat. She was not running, she was not lifting. She was moving through a sequence of techniques that Briley recognized because he had seen them before in a different context, in a different country, in a training facility, where the people who moved this particular sequence were not captains on routine rotation. She moved through it slowly, the way someone moves through something they have memorized so completely that it has become a form of thinking. Each position exact, each transition deliberate. The kind of precision that does not come from a class or a program. It comes from years of repetition until the motion lives in the body rather than the mindspine. Briley stood there for 30 seconds. He did not announce himself. He turned and walked back toward the door, and he did not tell anyone what he had seen. But he did not forget it. The filing shifted in a way he could not yet name, the way a foundation shifts before anyone notices the crack in the wall above it. Colonel Donovan Hargrove had commanded Fort Bragg Support Command for 8 years, which was longer than any commanding officer in the base's recent history. This was not an accident. Hargrove was by every official measure an excellent officer. His efficiency reports were spotless. His unit performance metrics consistently ranked in the top tier of the command. He had served in the Gulf War, had a chest full of decorations, and moved through the institution with the ease of a man who understood its machinery well enough to use it rather than merely operate within it. There was a photograph in his office that most visitors noticed before they noticed anything else. It was taken in 1991 somewhere in Kuwait in the flat light of the desert afternoon. A younger Hargrove, 24 years old and lean, in the way that young soldiers are before the decades settle on them, was carrying a wounded soldier across his back. The landscape behind them was nothing but sand and distance. Hargrove's face was turned slightly toward the camera. Not for the camera, just the accident of a glance, and what was on his face was not heroism or performance. It was the absolute focus of a man who has decided on one thing and will not be moved from it until it is done. He had carried that soldier 3 kilometers to the nearest aid point. This was the part of Donovan Hargrove that the institution had rewarded. The mission-first absolutism. The willingness to absorb pain as a matter of course. The certainty that made other men fall in behind him without being asked. What the institution had also rewarded, without quite intending to, was the control. Hargrove had learned early that authority in the army did not belong to the person with the highest rank in the room. It belonged to the person who occupied the most space. This was a lesson that served him well in Kuwait and in Bosnia, and in every posting that followed, because the army, like every institution, runs partly on competence and partly on the organized fiction of hierarchy, and the fiction holds as long as everyone agrees to maintain it. For 30 years, Hargrove had been very good at maintaining it. He was also, and this was the part that took people longer to see, very good at identifying the people who were not going to maintain it and removing them before they could become a disruption. He had done this dozens of times over the course of his career. He did not think of it as cruelty. He thought of it as management. He was 58 years old in the summer of 2025, and the habit was so old it had stopped being visible to him. The way a person with a particular reflex stops noticing when it fires. He formed his opinion of Maya Carter in the first 30 seconds of their introduction. It was not about her gender. This was the thing that made Hargrove genuinely different from a simpler version of the same story. 2 years earlier, in 2023, a visiting officer had made a series of inappropriate comments to one of Fort Bragg's female staff officers, and Hargrove had handled it swiftly and without sentimentality. He did not tolerate that kind of disruption. It was bad for order. What Hargrove could not tolerate was the specific quality of a person's gaze when it did not defer. Most people, when introduced to Colonel Donovan Hargrove for the first time, performed a small and barely perceptible adjustment, a straightening, a recalibration of posture that communicated without words that they understood the nature of the hierarchy they had just entered. They did not necessarily do this consciously. It was the body responding to something it recognized. Maya Carter did not do it. She looked at him with the direct assessing attention of someone who was deciding whether she trusted him yet. The answer visible in that look was not yet. It was not disrespect. It was not aggression. It was simply the absence of automatic deference, and Donovan Hargrove had not encountered it in a very long time. He said something under his breath as she moved away from the introduction, too low for most people to catch. She caught it. She did not react. But something behind her eyes sharpened very slightly, and then she turned and walked to her seat. The first few weeks were a kind of weather. Present difficult, but not yet fully broken. In the weekly officer briefing, Maya presented a situation report on supply logistics for the Southern Range that was thorough and well considered. She had identified 3 inconsistencies in the delivery schedule that were costing her unit operational time, and she laid them out with the efficiency of someone who had prepared the material, knew the material, and expected it to be addressed because that was the purpose of a briefing. Hargrove waited until she was about halfway through. He interrupted with a slow wave of his hand. The gesture was not dramatic. It did not need to be. It occupied the particular middle ground that people in authority use when they want to end something without quite acknowledging that they are ending it. Logistics captain's answer, he said, not a field commander's. He moved on without looking at her. Maya closed her notebook. She wrote the date and the time in the margin. She did not say anything. The following week, the same order she had issued to her unit regarding a repositioning exercise appeared in the command log under Hargrove's name. The content was identical. Not similar, identical down to the phrasing. The only thing that had changed was the signature at the bottom. She noted it, filed it, kept working. The promotion paperwork for Garrett Finn came back from command with a single word written across the top. Denied, no explanation, no date for reconsideration. She called Finn into her office. He was 19 years old and trying very hard not to show that it bothered him. She could see him working at it, the jaw setting slightly, the eyes going to the middle distance. She said, "This is not a reflection of your work. It is a reflection of something else entirely." He said, "Yes, ma'am." He meant it as acceptance, not agreement, and she recognized the difference. After he left, she sat with her hands flat on the desk for a moment, and then she picked up her pen and continued with the work. There was always more work. The work was the thing she could control, and she controlled it completely. Briley came to her after the second briefing interruption. He waited until the room cleared, then took a step toward her with the careful precision of a man who had measured the moment and decided to proceed. He said, "You're going to want to learn when to stay quiet, Captain." He was not threatening her. What he was doing was what experienced people do when they have seen a pattern play out before and are trying to spare someone the full cost of it. He had watched 3 officers go up against Hargrove's management style in the past 6 years. All 3 had left Fort Bragg with something permanently reduced in them. Maya looked at him steadily. She said with respect, "Sergeant, staying quiet is how we got here." Briley did not answer. He stood for a beat longer than the silence required, and then he left. He thought about it over dinner. He thought about it again, lying in his bunk. The woman had 2 combat tours on her record and a Purple Heart, and she had looked him straight in the eye and said something that was on balance correct. He did not change his assessment yet, but the assessment was no longer the same as it had been that morning. The note appeared on a Wednesday evening in the 3rd week of July. Maya returned to her quarters after a 10-hour day and found it on the floor just inside the door. Folded once plain white paper, no envelope. She picked it up and read it standing in the doorway. "Be careful. He watches you closer than the others." No signature, no identifying marks. The handwriting was deliberate, the kind that was trying not to be recognizable. She stood there holding it for a long moment. Outside her window, the base was going through its evening routines, the sounds of the end of a day, the distant clank of equipment being stowed, the far cadence of a late run. Ordinary sounds, the kind that made the piece of paper in her hand feel more significant, not less. She folded it and placed it in her notebook between 2 pages of field notes. She did not know who had written. She did not know yet what it meant in the full sense of what it would come to mean. What she knew was that someone on this base had seen something worth warning her about and had decided she was the right person to warn. She sat down at her desk. She opened her notebook, and below where she had filed the note, she wrote the date, the time, and what she knew so far. It did not take up much space on the page. Not yet. Outside, the flag cracked hard in a sudden gust of evening wind. The same flag they all saluted every morning. The same sky over the same base where every soldier there had agreed to the same set of obligations. Maya looked at the page. She picked up her pen. She had made a promise to her father 16 years ago, and she had kept it through 2 wars and a grief that had no clean edge to it, and she had no intention of breaking it now. Not here. Not for this. She had to be careful. She started writing. Part 2. The pressure. The supply requisitions disappeared on a Monday, not all of them. That would have been too obvious, too easy to escalate through proper channels with a clear paper trail and a straightforward complaint. What disappeared were 6 specific line items from Maya's unit logistics requests, the kind that were not dramatic in themselves, but that when absent created a friction that accumulated over days and spread through an operational unit the way a small leak spreads through a wall. Replacement parts for 2 vehicles scheduled for maintenance. A medical resupply for the unit aid station. Training ammunition for a range qualification that had already been postponed once. Maya submitted the follow-up request through the standard channel on Tuesday morning. On Thursday afternoon, she received a form response indicating the request was under review. By the end of the following week, the request had been in review for 11 days, 4 days past the maximum processing window stipulated in the command's own logistics protocol. She submitted a formal inquiry. The inquiry was acknowledged and routed to a staff officer whose name she did not recognize and who did not respond. She kept working. She kept writing things down. The notebook was filling up in a way she had not anticipated when she arrived at Fort Bragg 6 weeks earlier. It had started as a field log, the ordinary record-keeping of a unit commander. Now it contains something else alongside those things. Dates and times and the precise language of specific exchanges. The denial of Finn's promotion. The appropriated orders. The supply requisitions, each one logged with submission date, protocol deadline, and current status. She had not decided what she was building yet, but she had learned in 2 wars and 15 years of service that the difference between a complaint and a case was documentation. One went nowhere. The other had weight. In the 2nd week of August, Hargrove began communicating directly with her soldiers. A commanding officer could speak to any member of any unit on the base, but there was a difference between a general engagement with the troops and what Hargrove was doing. He was pulling individual members of Maya's unit aside during training rotations and issuing guidance that contradicted her standing orders without informing her. Twice, soldiers came to her confused about which instruction to follow. Both times she absorbed the confusion, gave them clear direction, and thanked them for bringing it to her. She did not let any of it reach her face, not in front of her unit. A commander's face was a kind of broadcast, and she had learned early that the first thing soldiers read was not what their officers said, but what their officer's face said before the words arrived. She felt the effect on the unit's energy, the slight hesitation before a response, the eyes that checked the direction of the command building before settling on her. It was not disloyalty. It was the instinct common to every social organization that has ever existed to locate the source of actual power and orient toward it. She understood it. She did not resent it. She worked harder. The physical stress test was ordered on a Wednesday with 24 hours notice, which was itself irregular. Standard protocol required a minimum of 72 hours notification, except in the case of emergency readiness evaluations, which this was not. The orders applied specifically to her unit. The assessment was scheduled for noon on Thursday. August in North Carolina on an open drill field with no shade was not the same as August in most other places. The heat came up off the packed earth and mixed with the heat pressing down from a sky that had no clouds in it, and it bore down from both directions in a way that made the air itself feel like something to push through rather than breathe. The assessment consisted of a 2-mile run, 300 meters of sandbag carry in full gear, a timed push-up sequence, and a final circuit through an obstacle course set at parameters above the standard physical fitness test. These were not impossible demands. They were calibrated to sit at the upper edge of what a unit could be expected to meet without preparation under these specific conditions, which was the entire point. Hargrove watched from the observation tower above the field. He had a clipboard and 2 staff officers beside him. He did not come down. Maya's soldiers lined up in formation at 11:55. She took her position beside them. Not in front, not behind. Beside them in the line with her helmet on and her rifle slung and the same equipment they were carrying. Garrett Finn was 3 positions to her left. He was 19 years old and weighed 160 pounds, and he was on a Thursday afternoon in August, under a sun that had no mercy in it, one of the youngest and least experienced people in the formation. He looked straight ahead with the focus of someone who had committed to exactly one thing, which was that he was going to finish. He said quietly, almost to himself, "You don't have to run with us, ma'am." Maya turned her head and gave him a look that was not harsh, but was unambiguous. She said, "You're not running without me." The signal was given. She ran. Not for show, not to construct a moment she could later describe to an investigating officer. She ran because her soldiers were running and because she had believed since the first day she put on a uniform that the word leadership was empty unless the person using it was willing to be in the same conditions as the people they led. Her father had believed this. She had absorbed it the way children absorb the things that are demonstrated rather than stated. The sandbag carry was the hardest part. 60 pounds, uneven ground, full gear, and the heat pressing in from every direction. She carried her bag and watched her soldiers carry theirs and made small adjustments of pace to keep the unit together. They finished the circuit first, every last one of them. In the observation tower, Hargrove stood without writing anything on his clipboard. The knuckles of the hand that held it were white. He watched Maya Carter lead her unit off the field in the manner of a man processing an outcome he had not accounted for. That night, Marcus Briley came to the motor pool. Maya was there alone reviewing maintenance reports by the light of a single overhead bulb that buzzed in the heavy evening air. She heard his boots on the concrete and looked up. He stopped about 6 feet from her, carrying a worn manila folder that had been folded and refolded so many times the creases had gone soft. He stood without speaking for a moment, the way men of a certain experience stand when they are confirming a decision already made. Then he set the folder on the workbench beside her maintenance log. She looked at it. She looked at him. He said, "I've been keeping that for a long time. Didn't know what I was going to do with it. Figured someday somebody would want it." She opened the folder. The pages inside were handwritten, which surprised her. Not typed, not printed, not the official documentation of a formal complaint. Pages covered in Briley's precise economical handwriting. Each entry had a date, a name, a unit designation, and a brief summary. Some entries were a single line. Others ran to half a page. 31 names. Starting in 2017, the year Hargrove arrived at Fort Bragg, running through to the spring of 2024. Women mostly, but not exclusively. Junior officers, male and female. A chaplain. a logistics coordinator with 3 deployments who had left the Army 6 months into her assignment at Fort Bragg, reasons cited in the official records as personal. The entries describe patterns rather than single incidents. Inappropriate proximity, orders issued to undermine, careers delayed without documented cause. Formal complaints submitted and then resolved before they reached the level of command that would have required real action. She turned the last page and sat with it. She said, "Did any of these go through official channels?" He said 8 of them. 4 were marked resolved within 30 days. 2 were lost in the filing system. 2 more were referred upward. I never found out where they went. She said, "Why didn't you submit this yourself?" He was quiet for a moment. The quiet of a man who has asked himself this question many times and has not found an answer he is proud of. He said, "Because I watched what happened to the people who did, and I have 8 years left before retirement, and I made myself believe that meant something." She did not tell him it was all right. It was not all right, and he knew it, and she respected him enough not to pretend otherwise. But she understood the arithmetic of it, the terrible practical calculation that people and institutions make when the cost of speaking is borne entirely by the person who speaks and not at all by the institution that forces the choice. She said, "This matters now." That's what it is. He nodded once, he started to turn, then stopped. He said, "There's one more thing, something I couldn't get in writing, a name." He told her the name, he told her the year. She wrote it down. 2 days later, Maya found the medical report. It was not where it should have been. She had been looking for something else, a record related to one of her soldiers' pre-deployment physicals, and she had gone 3 levels deeper into the system than the search required. The report was filed under a miscellaneous administrative category that was effectively a holding area for documents that had been processed but not properly sorted. The file number was FC-MED-2019-089. The date was October 14, 2019. The patient was Lieutenant Dana Fields, assigned to Fort Bragg Support Command. The injury was documented as a fractured left wrist. The cause was listed as training accident. The notation at the bottom, the section reserved for follow-up actions and case resolution, contained a single line. Resolved internally per command authorization. The authorizing signature was Colonel Donovan Hargrove. Below the signature, a date. October 19, 2019. 5 days after the injury was reported. Maya sat in front of the screen for a long time. She pulled up the personnel records. Lieutenant Dana Fields had been assigned to Fort Bragg Support Command beginning in September 2019. She had been transferred out on November 7, 2019. Reason cited personal request. 19 days after the medical report was filed. 24 days after the injury occurred. Maya sat with the arithmetic of that. She thought about the 31 names in Briley's folder. She thought about the 8 complaints that had gone through proper channels and found their way into resolutions in silence. She thought about the photograph in Hargrove's office, the young man carrying a wounded soldier 3 kilometers across Kuwait because he had decided that was the thing he was doing. She thought about what it meant that a man could hold both of those things inside him. The photograph and the signature at the bottom of a report that made a woman's broken wrist disappear into a miscellaneous file. She printed the report. She added it to her notebook. She wrote the file number, the date, and the name. She did not sleep well that night. The confrontation in the operations room happened 6 days before the drill yard. Maya had been there for 3 hours reviewing a logistics assessment when she heard the door. Hargrove entered alone. He shut it behind him. She continued with the map she was rolling up, and when she was finished, she turned to face him. He said, "You have a habit of making my men uncomfortable." She said nothing. She waited. He moved closer with the deliberate displacement of space that was itself a kind of language. He was 6 feet tall and 58 years old and had been the largest presence in every room he entered for 3 decades. He said, "You think discipline makes you respected. It doesn't. It makes you difficult." She said with respect, "Sir, I'm here to lead soldiers, not manage their comfort." He was close now. Too close. Close enough that she could see the muscle working in his jaw and the particular quality of color in his face that came from a man who had reached the end of his tolerance. He said bold. For a woman, the words were not loud. They were almost casual, delivered in the quiet voice of someone who had learned that quiet was more effective than volume when you wanted something to land. Maya held his gaze for 1 full second. She said, "Permission to leave, sir." The room held the weight of it. Hargrove stood there with his eyes on her face, and something moved behind them that was not quite anger or not only anger. It was the expression of a man encountering something that refuses to behave according to the rules he has spent 30 years enforcing. He took 1 step back. Maya walked to the door. She opened it and stepped through into the evening air, and the flag at the top of its post snapped hard in a sudden gust. And she walked back to her quarters with her hands at her sides and her breathing measured, and her mind moving through what had just happened with the same methodical clarity she applied to everything else. She wrote it down. Date, time, the exact words. She was ready for what came next. It came on a Tuesday. August 14th, the drill yard at 1400 hours with 300 soldiers in formation and the sky flat and white above the field and the heat rising off the packed earth in visible waves. Maya's unit was running a live maneuver, a repositioning exercise at standard parameters. She was observing the left flank when she identified what any experienced field commander would have identified immediately, a vulnerability in the positioning of the forward element that in a live environment would have represented an unacceptable exposure. The correction was procedurally straightforward. She issued the repositioning order through proper channel to her unit within the boundaries of her command authority. She heard Hargrove's voice before she saw him move. He was standing at the edge of the field, and he came forward onto it, which was not where the commanding officer stood during a unit exercise unless he was participating in the command structure, which he was not. He came forward and his voice carried across the full width of the drill yard because he intended it to. Captain Carter, who authorized that repositioning? 300 soldiers heard it, heads turned. The movement of the exercise slowed and then stopped the way all large coordinated activities stop when something outside the expected pattern occurs. Maya turned to face him. She said, per field protocol, sir, I observed a vulnerability in the left flank and acted within my command authority to correct it. He was already moving toward her, not running, moving with the momentum of a man who has chosen a direction and is not going to be redirected. The clipboard was in his left hand. His right hand was at his side. He said, that is not your call to make. She said, sir, I acted in accordance with standard field assessment procedure. He said, don't lecture me on standards. He was too close now. Closer than protocol allowed between officers in any context, close enough that the geometry of his approach was its own statement. She could see the particular quality of his face clearly. The jaw set the color of exertion and fury, the eyes of a man who had reached a threshold he had spent 8 years approaching and had finally decided to cross. His right hand came up. It rose with the momentum of a shoulder that had committed to the motion. Not fully extended, not yet completed, but in motion, unmistakably in motion, in the direction of her face. 300 soldiers saw it. In the fraction of a second that followed, Maya Carter made the calculation her father had spent years teaching her to make. Not the technique. The technique was not a decision. It lived in her body the way breathing lived there, available without deliberation the moment the conditions required it. What she calculated was the threshold. Her father had told her there was a line, not between violence and peace, but between the moment when action changed something and the moment when inaction made something worse. He had never told her where the line was. He had told her she would know it when she reached it. She had reached it. Her left hand came up. The motion was precise and took less than 1 second from initiation to completion. She intercepted his wrist in the upswing, pivoted from the hip, applied pressure at the correct angle with the correct leverage, and stepped through. It was the same sequence she had been moving through in the gym at 5 in the morning, the same sequence her father had corrected with 2 fingers on Saturday mornings in a San Antonio backyard, and it had lived in her body for 23 years, waiting for a moment she had spent 16 of those years hoping would never arrive. The crack was sharp and clean, cutting through the August heat the way a rifle shot cuts through still water. Hargrove went to one knee. The clipboard hit the ground. His mouth opened, and no sound came out for 2 full seconds, which was how long it took the pain to fully arrive. Maya released his wrist and straightened. Her boots were planted. Her back was straight. She said, "You will never raise your hand at me again, sir." The drill yard was absolutely silent. For the first time since the summer she was 16 years old, Maya Carter had used what her father taught her. She had broken the promise in under 1 second on a Tuesday afternoon in August in front of 300 witnesses. She stood in the silence and felt the adrenaline moving through her in the controlled, familiar way of a person trained to manage it. She looked out at the formation at 300 faces oriented toward her, and she understood in that moment with a clarity that had no room for doubt that she had crossed the threshold her father had spent years teaching her to recognize. She did not know yet whether he would have understood why. She looked at the formation. Her voice when she spoke was steady and carried across the full yard. She said back to attention. They obeyed, not because of rank, because something had occurred in front of them that their bodies recognized before their minds could name it. The kind of thing that happens rarely and changes the temperature of whatever space it happens in. A medic was already crossing the field. A radio was already transmitting. Behind Maya, a staff officer was speaking rapidly into a headset. Hargrove did not look at anyone. He was on his knee in the dirt of the drill yard, his arm held against his chest by his other hand, his face the color of old chalk. For the first time in 8 years, he was not the largest presence on the field. He was just a man on his knee in the August dust. Within the hour, the administrative machinery was moving. Maya was escorted to the command building by a duty officer who was professional and uncomfortable in equal measure and placed in a temporary office, not in custody, but in the suspended state that the military applies to situations that have not yet been fully categorized. Investigating Officer Colonel Stuart Keene arrived 40 minutes later. He was a trim man in his early 50s with the bearing of someone who had spent a career determining what had actually happened, and he had, Maya could see immediately, already reviewed the footage. He set a tablet on the table. On the screen was a paused frame from a drone feed showing the drill yard from above two figures at the center, one standing and one beginning to kneel. He said, "Colonel Hargrove's arm is broken. Radio fracture." She said he raised his hand to strike me. He said, "The footage confirms that, but you acted physically against a superior officer." She said, "I defended myself, which I am authorized to do." He looked at her. She looked back. He said, "Why didn't you de-escalate?" She said, "I did. I de-escalated for 6 weeks. I de-escalated every time he interrupted my briefings, every time he reissued my orders under his name, every time he contacted my soldiers directly to undermine my authority. I de-escalated in a room where he was alone with me and said things I have documented. When he raised his hand to strike me in front of 300 soldiers, I stopped the assault with minimum force. That is de-escalation." Keene was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Since this morning, my inbox has received statements. Officers, staff enlisted, some short, some detailed. They all reference one thing." He paused. He said, "They all mention a history." Maya said nothing. He picked up the tablet and stood. Then he stopped at the door without turning around. He said, "That notebook you carry, the one I've been told you write in." She waited. He said, "Keep it safe." He left. General Clifford Rains arrived on base the following morning in a vehicle with DC plates. He was a tall man with the groomed impassivity of someone who had spent decades navigating the space between institutional reality and institutional presentation. He called a closed meeting with the legal team. The words Maya heard secondhand were contain, manage, minimize, exposure. The plan was to transfer Maya to Westfield Command Center in Virginia under the designation of a standard operational rotation. Publicly, it would look like a routine reassignment. Privately, it removed her from Fort Bragg before the situation attracted more attention. Maya accepted the transfer, not because she was willing to be removed, because she understood the difference between a battle and a war, and understood that the war was going to require her to be somewhere other than this room with these people. She went back to her quarters and began to pack. The knock came at 2100 hours. She opened the door to find Briley standing in the corridor with a plain envelope, legal size, unsealed. He held it out. She took it. Inside were photocopies. Every page of the handwritten record, each one now bearing a second signature below the entry it documented. 31 signatures from 31 people who had been contacted, who had confirmed, who had signed their names to something that could now be used. She looked up at him. He said, "For the hearing." He turned and walked back down the corridor without another word. She stood there holding the envelope. She had her notebook. She had the medical report with its file number, its date, its authorizing signature. She had 31 signed confirmations. She had 6 weeks of documented incidents. The next morning, General Patricia Stone requested a private meeting. It was brief. Stone sat across from her in a plain room and told her without softening it that the command had decided promoting Maya in the current year was not operationally viable. Too much attention, too much political complexity. The promotion was not denied permanently. It was simply not happening now. Maya sat with that for a moment. She said, "That's fine, General. I didn't do it for a promotion." Stone looked at her for a long moment. The older woman's face carried the particular quality of someone who has heard many things and learned to keep most of her responses internal. But something in it shifted slightly, the way a face shifts when recognition passes through it. She said, "I knew your father. Class of '87 Ranger School. He'd have said the same thing, that was all. One sentence. No elaboration, no expansion. Just that." Maya nodded. She finished packing that afternoon. She sat on the edge of her bunk and looked at her hands, which were not shaking. She thought about a Saturday morning in a San Antonio backyard and a man with carved hands who had told her the goal was never to win a fight. She had broken the promise. She had broken it in 1 second in public with 300 witnesses on a drill field in August. She did not know yet whether she had done the right thing. She picked up her notebook. She put it in her bag. She went to find out. Part 3, The Reckoning. She had been on the road from Fort Bragg to Virginia for 4 hours when it occurred to her that this was the first time in 6 weeks she had been entirely alone. No unit, no duty roster, no formation waiting for her to take her position beside it. The silence in the car was different from the silence of the drill yard on August 14th. That silence had been held collectively by 300 people at the same moment. This one was hers. She drove through it and let it be what it was. Westfield Command Center sat on a low-rise in the Virginia countryside 40 miles southwest of Washington, a complex of concrete and reinforced glass that had been designed to look unremarkable from the outside, which it succeeded at completely. The surrounding land was rolling in green, the kind of landscape that suggested permanence and quiet, and the contrast with Fort Bragg's flat heat-pressed drill fields was significant enough that Maya noticed it on the drive in the way the air changed, the way the trees came closer to the road. She arrived on a Thursday morning with a duffel bag, a transfer order, and the particular quality of alertness that comes from being in a new place where you do not yet know the layout of the exits. Her official designation was Strategic Operations Liaison, a title constructed to sound substantial while containing as little operational specificity as possible. It was, she understood, a container, a place to hold her while the machinery at Fort Bragg sorted itself out. The people who had authorized the transfer intended it as management, a way of moving her far enough from the center of the situation that she would stop generating attention. What they had not accounted for was that the attention had already left Fort Bragg. In her first 48 hours at Westfield, 3 different officers stopped her in hallways or common areas. One of them was a colonel she had never met who asked for nothing and said only this: "My daughter's at Fort Campbell. I'm glad people like you are still in uniform." He walked away before she could respond. She sat with that for a while. The story had moved faster than official reports. Military forums contained threads running to hundreds of responses. The phrase she kept hearing secondhand, the one that had apparently attached itself to the event with the tenacity of something both accurate and resonant, was the snap heard round the base. She had not chosen the phrase. She would not have chosen it. But she understood why it existed. People needed handles for things that mattered, and sometimes the handles were blunt. On her 5th day at Westfield, Major Renee Holloway called her into a meeting room on the 3rd floor. Holloway was 41 years old, an operations analyst with a record that read like a series of problems other people had abandoned, and a directness that did not waste the time of the person it was directed at. She slid a folder across the table and let Maya open it before she spoke. The folder contained a mandate, unofficial designation, no letterhead, but signed by a name that Maya recognized as belonging to an office 3 levels above General Rains. An internal review of command climate across 6 installations with documented irregularities and complaint processing. Fort Bragg was first on the list. The other 5 were bases Maya recognized 2 of them from her own service history. Holloway said, "You're not here to sit behind a screen. You're here because someone upstairs finally received the message. They want a task force. Small, discreet, starting with the files." Maya looked at the list. The second installation on it was a base she had been assigned to 8 years earlier. She had been a lieutenant then. She had kept her mouth shut for reasons she had understood at the time, and that she had carried since with the particular weight of things done for practical reasons that do not become easier to justify with distance. She said, "I'll do it." Holloway said, "I figured." What followed were 3 weeks of the most concentrated work Maya had done outside of a combat deployment. The task force was 4 people: herself, Holloway, and 2 analysts. They worked through complaint records and medical files and transfer documentation and personnel evaluations across all 6 installations. They were not looking for individual incidents. They were looking for patterns. The signature of a systemic failure, the way a leak in a foundation is not visible in any single crack, but becomes unmistakable when you look at all of them together. The patterns were unmistakable. Complaints filed and resolved within 30 days with no documented investigation. Transfer requests appearing within weeks of formal complaints, the transfers assigned to the complainant rather than the subject. Medical reports filed under miscellaneous administrative categories. Promotion delays with no stated cause. Personnel evaluations that were technically clean, but that read against everything else in the file carried the careful language of someone covering something they could not afford to name directly. At Fort Bragg alone, the documented pattern extended without interruption from October 2017, the first full month of Hargrove's command, to August 14, 2025. 8 years, 1 month, and 14 days. Ending on the afternoon, the crack echoed across the drill field. They worked. They documented. They built something that had weight. At the same time, in a different room in a different building, things were unraveling for Donovan Hargrove in ways he had not anticipated. The investigation conducted by Colonel Stuart Keene had recovered footage from 3 camera angles: a drone feed, a fixed-base surveillance camera, and a helmet-mounted unit from a soldier in the formation. All 3 showed the same sequence from different angles: Hargrove advancing, his hand rising, the movement of Maya's arm, the crack, Hargrove on his knee. What they also found in the course of cataloging the footage was the absence of a 4th recording. The camera mounted at the base of the observation tower, the one closest to where Hargrove had been standing before he walked onto the field, showed a gap. Not a malfunction, not a recording error, a deletion performed manually at 14:23 on August 14th, 9 minutes after the incident. The deletion was logged by the base security system, and the log showed the account credentials used to authorize it. The credentials belonged to General Clifford Rains. Keene brought this to General Patricia Stone privately, without filing it through the standard channel, because the standard channel was the same channel that had been used to resolve Dana Fields' broken wrist in 19 days and to make 31 complaints disappear into administrative filing categories over 8 years. He brought it directly to Stone because she was the one person in the chain of command whose own record contained nothing suggesting participation. Stone read the report. She sat with it for a long time. Then she picked up the phone. Rains did not wait to be formally charged. Within 12 hours of Stone's call, he submitted a request to be voluntarily included in the investigation as a cooperative witness, which is the language that people in institutional positions use when they understand that the alternative is to be included as a subject. His legal counsel issued a brief statement. He did not give an interview. His operational duties were suspended pending review. The career of General Clifford Rains, built over 34 years on the ability to be in the right room at the right time and to understand which way the institution was moving before anyone else did, ended in a Tuesday afternoon phone call from Patricia Stone that lasted 11 minutes. Maya learned about the metadata in the deletion and Rains' cooperation from Holloway, who told her in 3 sentences without editorializing. She sat with it for a moment and then went back to the files because the files were what mattered and there was still work to do. But she thought about it that night in her quarters at Westfield, the Virginia dark outside the window, and the work spread across the desk beside her. She thought about a man who had signed his name to the bottom of a document that made a woman's broken wrist disappear in 2019, and then 6 years later used his account credentials to delete footage that might have made another woman's case harder to dismiss. Both times done not in rage, but in the calm, institutional reflex of someone managing a liability. She did not feel satisfaction about it. She felt something more complicated than that. The particular fatigue of being right about something you had wished you were wrong about. The Article 32 hearing was scheduled for a Thursday in late September at Fort Myer, Virginia. The decision to hold it publicly had been made at the congressional level, where a bipartisan group of senators had been asking questions with a specificity indicating they had received information from inside the military investigation. The Army did not announce the public nature of the hearing with enthusiasm. It announced it the way institutions announce the things they have concluded they cannot avoid. The courtroom at Fort Myer was wood-paneled and formal, in the way that rooms are formal when the formality is intended to communicate that what happens inside them matters. No cameras, but 4 sketch artists positioned at different angles and reporters in the gallery whose presence had been authorized under a public interest provision that the Army's legal office had spent 2 weeks trying to find a reason to deny and finally could not. Hargrove sat at the defense table in his dress uniform. The ribbons on his chest represented 30 years of service, and he wore them with the habit of a man for whom they had long since become simply part of how he presented himself to the world. His right arm was in a brace. He did not look at the gallery when he entered. He looked at the front wall. Maya entered from a side door with Holloway 2 steps behind her. The room's attention shifted the way attention shifts when something that has been discussed at a distance suddenly becomes present in the same space. She walked to her seat with the quality of posture that is not performance, but is the body expressing what the mind has resolved. She did not look at Hargrove. The presiding judge advocate general was a silver-haired colonel named Wardell, who had the economy of expression of someone who had spent 30 years distinguishing between what was legally relevant and everything else. He opened the proceedings with his standard language and called the first witness. Maya took the oath with her hand flat and her voice clear. Then she spoke. She had spent 3 weeks thinking not about the words, but about the structure of what she wanted to place in front of the panel. She had decided early that she was not going to lead with the drill yard. The drill yard was the visible surface. It was real and it mattered, but it was the end of a story, not the story itself. She started with October 2017. She told them about the pattern, not as a list, but as a cumulative picture built from the documentation in her notebook and the medical report and Briley's folder, each element placed with the precision of someone who had spent 3 weeks ensuring that what she said was not a single person's recollection, but a documented record of what had occurred. She described the interrupted briefings and the appropriated orders and the block promotions with the specificity of dates and times that made them facts rather than impressions. She described the note under her door. She described the room where Hargrove stood close enough that his breath touched her face. She described the 31 names. She described Dana Fields. She said Colonel Hargrove did not begin with violence. He began with erosion, with the small, deniable, accumulated pressure of someone who understood that the most effective way to remove a person was to make them disappear from the inside before anyone noticed they were gone. He did this for 8 years. He was able to do it for 8 years because the system that was supposed to respond to it provided the mechanisms for it to continue. Complaints were resolved. Records were misfiled. People were transferred. The result of 8 years of this is 31 names in a handwritten folder kept by a staff sergeant who did not know what else to do with it. She paused. She said I stopped his arm because it was moving toward my face, and I had calculated in that moment that there was no version of the next second in which doing nothing left anyone better off. I did what I was trained to do. I neutralized a threat. The fact that the threat was wearing the same uniform I was wearing, the fact that it carried the rank of colonel, does not change what it was. She looked at the panel. She said I have been asked why I didn't de-escalate. I want to be precise. De-escalation is not the same as compliance. De-escalation is the sustained effort to prevent a situation from becoming worse. I made that effort every day for 42 days. What happened on August 14th was the moment when that effort had been exhausted and the situation had become what it had always been moving toward. The defense attorney objected to the characterization. The presiding colonel looked at him for a moment and said overruled. Let her finish. She finished. 4 officers followed her to the stand over the next 2 days. A lieutenant who described being berated in front of a full formation for declining an off-base function that Hargrove had made functionally mandatory. A staff officer who had filed a formal complaint in 2021 and received a resolution letter within 3 weeks, documenting a thorough investigation she had never been contacted about. A senior NCO with 6 years at Fort Bragg who described in the careful language of someone who had thought precisely about what he was willing to say under oath a sustained pattern of targeted professional undermining applied specifically to personnel who demonstrated independence. The 4th witness was not on the original witness list. She appeared on the second morning of testimony. A woman in her mid-30s in civilian clothes cleared through the building's security process as a voluntary witness. She sat in the gallery for the first 2 hours of that session, and then she submitted a request to testify through proper channel, which was processed and approved within 40 minutes because the panel had read her name and understood what it meant. Her name was Dana Fields. She was 34 years old. She had left the Army in November 2019 with the reason listed on her transfer documentation as personal request, which was the language placed on the form by the administrative officer who processed it, not the language she had used. She had been working in civilian logistics management for 5 years. She had not expected to be in this room. She had composed and discarded the decision to come forward more times than she could accurately count, and had made the final decision 3 days earlier when she read a summary of the case in a Veteran Affairs newsletter that described in language careful but accurate what Maya Carter had stood up in front of. She took the stand. She confirmed the events of October 2019. She described them with the precision of someone for whom they had never become distant or abstract because there are certain things that do not recede regardless of how many years are placed between the person and the event. She confirmed that the documentation of her injury as a training accident had been the condition under which she was allowed to leave without a formal investigation, that would, she had been told, clearly damage her record and her future employment prospects more than a quiet transfer would. She said I was 28 years old and I had 2 deployments in 6 years building a career, and I believed what I was told. That is not a defense of the choice I made. It is a description of the conditions under which it was made. She paused. She said I have been watching Fort Bragg Support Command for 5 years. Not formally, not with any official capacity. I followed assignment records. I recognized the pattern because I was part of it 6 years before anyone else saw it clearly enough to document it. She looked at the panel, then she looked at Maya. She said, when Captain Carter arrived, I knew within 4 weeks that she was not going to leave the way I left. Not because she was a different kind of person, because the person who had been worn down for 6 years before she arrived had finally run out of patience for watching it happen again. She stopped. Then she said, I wrote the note. The one slipped under her door. I wrote it because I wanted her to know she was not alone in what she was seeing, and because I had spent 5 years wishing someone had put a note under mine. The room did not move. Maya was sitting at the witness table where she had been asked to remain for the duration of the testimony. She had been looking at the panel. When Fields said those words, she turned and looked at Fields, and Fields turned and looked at her, and whatever passed between them in that exchange did not have a name in the formal language of military proceedings or legal process. It was recognition. The specific, irreducible recognition of one person by another who has stood in a version of the same place and knows without being told exactly how the floor felt under their feet. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them needed to. The panel deliberated for 3 hours and 47 minutes. The verdict was unanimous. Colonel Donovan Hargrove was found guilty of conduct unbecoming an officer abuse of authority and multiple violations of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. He was stripped of command. He was reduced in grade to the rank of captain, the same rank as the woman whose face he had raised his hand toward on a Tuesday afternoon in August. He was dishonorably discharged from the United States Army with an effective date of 30 days from the reading of the verdict. His case was referred to the federal civilian court system for further proceedings on assault and harassment charges. He received the verdict without visible expression. The ribbons on his chest did not move. His face carried the look of a man who has arrived at the terminus of a very long road and is standing at the end of it processing what the end looks like. He did not look at Maya when he was escorted from the room. She found Dana Fields in the corridor outside the courtroom, sitting alone on a bench with her hands in her lap, her civilian clothes carrying the particular quality of someone who had dressed carefully for a room they had not been certain they could walk into. Maya sat down beside her. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Fields said, I didn't know if I was going to be able to walk through that door. Maya said, but you did. Fields looked at the floor. She said, I kept thinking about what I would have wanted someone to do in 2019. If the situation had been reversed. Maya said, you did it. Fields was quiet. Then she turned and looked at her directly. She said, does it go away? The thing you carry from a place like that? Maya thought about a Saturday morning in a San Antonio backyard. A man with hands like carved wood who corrected her form with 2 fingers and never once gave her praise she had not earned. She said it doesn't go away, but it stops being the heaviest thing you carry. Fields nodded slowly. It was not comfort she was receiving, and she knew it, and the fact that it was not comfort seemed to be exactly what made it land. They sat in the corridor for a few minutes more without speaking. 2 women on a bench outside a courtroom in Virginia, with the autumn light coming through the windows at the end of the hall. Then Fields stood, and Maya stood, and they shook hands, the way soldiers shake hands without ceremony, but with the full weight of what had been shared between them. Fields walked toward the exit. Maya watched her go. Then she turned and walked the other direction. The investigation of General Clifford Raines proceeded on a separate track, which was how such things were handled. His cooperation was noted in the official record. His culpability was documented. His career ended in the manner of careers that end not through formal verdict, but through the comprehensive removal of every structure that has sustained them across 3 decades. The Army does not always produce a dramatic conclusion to these processes. Sometimes the conclusion is simply that a man retires with a reduced pension and an official record that contains in a section requiring authorization to access the notation of findings that no one is in a hurry to announce publicly. Maya understood this was incomplete. She filed it alongside all the other things that were incomplete and moved forward because the alternative to moving forward was standing still in a room where the air had already been used. The phone call from Stone came 2 weeks after the verdict. Maya was at her desk at Westfield working through the 4th installation on the task force list when her phone showed Stone's number. The call lasted 6 minutes. When it ended, she sat for a moment with the phone in her hand. Stone had told her 3 things. The promotion review had been reconsidered. The political complexity that had made it non-viable 2 months earlier had been resolved in the manner that things are resolved when the people who had made them complex were no longer in their positions. A ceremony had been arranged at Fort Bragg, and the internal policy review completed by Maya's task force had been submitted to Eastern Command. Specific recommendations from the review, including a third-party reporting structure that bypassed local chain of command and an anonymous escalation pathway for complaint filing, had been approved for implementation across all installations under Eastern Command jurisdiction. The effective date was 90 days out. Stone did not tell her what the policy had been named in the internal documentation. Maya would learn that later from Holloway, who heard it from one of the analysts who saw it in a routing document that crossed her desk 6 months after the ceremony. In the unofficial shorthand used by the administrative staff who processed the implementation paperwork, the policy framework was referred to as the Carter Protocol. She did not know this when she returned to Fort Bragg. She drove down from Virginia on a morning in mid-October when the North Carolina air had finally released the summer and come into the particular clarity of early fall. The base looked the same from the gate, the same flat geometry of buildings and roads, and the flag at the top of its post, but she had been at enough places enough times to know that the physical appearance of a thing was not the same as the thing, and that Fort Bragg in October was a different installation than Fort Bragg in July, not because the buildings had changed, but because the people inside them had been through something that changes people. Stone met her at the gate, not with ceremony, just standing there in the morning light with her hands at her sides. She said, "You were right." Maya looked at her. Stone said about what happens when one soldier stands up. They walked together toward the parade field. The formation was already assembled. Nearly 300 soldiers in the clear October morning, standing with the quality of presence that comes from people who have chosen to be somewhere rather than been ordered to it. Not for inspection, not for the routine mechanics of military presentation. They were there because they had been told something was going to have happen, and they had come, which is a different quality of presence entirely. Garrett Finn was in the third row. He was still 19 years old, would be for another 3 months, and he had the contained energy of someone who has been waiting for something and can now see it arriving. He did not move out of formation. He stood with the stillness of a soldier who had learned that stillness was itself a form of respect. Marcus Brawley was at the end of the first row. He stood with his hands at his sides and his face in the neutral configuration of a man who has decided how he feels about something and does not require anyone else's acknowledgement of it. Stone stood in front of the formation and read the citation. It bore the seal of the Department of the Army and the signature of the Secretary of the Army, and it cited extraordinary moral courage, physical discipline, and unwavering commitment to the principles the institution was supposed to embody and had, in this instance, failed to embody without intervention. She pinned the silver oak leaf cluster to Maya's chest. The rank that went with it was Major. The formation responded, not in the coordinated synchrony of a rehearsed ceremony, but in the genuine and slightly uneven way that people respond when something is real. Some soldiers clapped. Some called out. Finn in the third row did not cheer. He stood with his jaw set and his eyes bright, and he brought his right hand up in a salute that was crisp and exact and carried in it everything he had absorbed in 11 months about what that gesture was supposed to mean when it was meant fully. Brawley did not cheer either. He raised his hand in the sharpest salute Maya had seen in 15 years of service, and the expression on his face was not happiness exactly. It was something more durable than happiness. The expression of a man who has waited a long time to do the right thing and has finally done it. Maya returned both salutes, each one separately, each one completely. She did not give a speech. There was nothing she needed to say to these people that she had not already said by standing in the same formation with them in August, by running the same circuit, in the same heat, by planting her boots in the same dirt and refusing to be moved. The ceremony ended. The formation broke. People dispersed in the particular way of a crowd gathered for a purpose and now released from it, and in that dispersal were small exchanges and nods, and the kind of moments that do not appear in official records, but are the actual substance of what happens in places where people go through things together. Maya stood on the parade field for a while after most of the others had gone. She looked at the flag, the same sky above it, the same installation beneath her feet, the packed earth of the drill yard visible from where she stood, the place where the crack had rolled across the August heat 6 weeks ago and changed everything it touched. She thought about Dana Field sitting in a civilian office for 5 years, carrying a folder of records she had taken out of the Army in a box. She thought about Briley keeping his handwritten pages in a worn manila folder for 8 years because he believed that someday somebody would want them. She thought about 31 people who had entered complaints into a system that resolved them quietly and moved them elsewhere, who had made the calculation that the cost of continuing was higher than the cost of leaving and had lived with that calculation ever since. She thought about her father. She walked to the parking area and got into her vehicle and sat for a moment with the engine off. She reached into the breast pocket of her dress uniform and took out the dog tag. The metal was warm from her body. She held it in her palm, feeling the stamped letters with her thumb. Master Sergeant James Carter, 75th Ranger Regiment. The information reduced to its essentials the way the Army reduced everything to its essentials, because in the field the essentials were what survived. He had spent years teaching her not to be afraid of anyone in the world. He had taught her the geometry of pressure and leverage and the mechanics of survival, and he had believed with the certainty of a man who had tested the belief against the hardest conditions he had ever encountered, that the most important skill he had was not any single technique. It was knowing when. She had saved the when for 16 years. She had spent 16 years keeping a promise to a dead man, carrying it through 2 wars, and a grief that had no clean edge, carrying it through the accumulation of everything that had happened at Fort Bragg, and she had finally set it down at 1417 on a Tuesday afternoon in August, when the arithmetic was clear and there was no longer any version of the next second in which keeping it left anyone better off. She understood now that the promise had never been about the skill. Her father had not taught her Krav Maga so that she would never use it. He had taught her so she would know the difference between using it for the wrong reasons and using it for the only reason that mattered. He had been teaching her the threshold all along. She put the dog tag back in her pocket. She reached into her bag and took out the notebook. She opened it to the last page containing writing the final entries from Fort Bragg, the documentation assembled over 6 weeks of careful work. Dates and times and exact language and 31 names and a medical report with a file number and an authorizing signature. Everything that had been invisible before she began writing it down given weight by the simple act of being recorded. She turned the page. The next page was blank. She uncapped her pen. She thought about her father's handwriting, the careful, unhurried script of a man who believed that how you wrote something was connected to how you thought about it. She had been practicing that handwriting since she was 9 years old on Saturday mornings in a San Antonio backyard. She wrote 2 words at the top of the page: never again. She looked at them for a moment. Then she put the cap back on the pen and closed the notebook and set it on the seat beside her. She put the key in the ignition. She looked through the windshield at the road that ran straight and clear in the October morning light, the kind of road that asked nothing of the person driving it except attention and forward motion. Her father had told her the goal was never to win a fight. The goal was to make the fight unnecessary. And if that failed, the goal was to end it before it became something worse. She had done exactly what he taught her. 31 names were on record in a formal proceeding that would outlast every person who had been in that courtroom. A policy framework was working its way through the administrative channels of Eastern Command, 90 days from implementation, its name not yet known to her. Dana Fields was driving back to Virginia with the particular quality of freedom that comes from finally setting down something you have carried too long. Marcus Briley was walking back across the parade field with his hands at his sides and 8 years of handwritten pages no longer weighing his pocket. And Garrett Finn, 19 years old and 11 months in uniform, was standing somewhere on this base, having learned on a Tuesday afternoon in August what a salute was actually supposed to mean. Maya started the engine. The gate passed behind her. The road opened ahead. The October light came through the trees on both sides of it, clear and unhurried, the kind of light that does not ask what came before. She drove.